So we have covered aperture and we've covered shutter speed in the last two videos, and to be honest, they can be pretty dry subjects, but it's about knowing what you can do with them that gets exciting. Once we understand them, once we understand the effect that they can have on our photographs, we can really start to use them creatively. So we talked about depth of field with aperture, and we talked about shutter speed and creating motion blur and all those sorts of things with shutter speed. But it's how you then combine them, because the problem is that essentially they're on a sliding scale. For every time that you increase the shutter speed, you decrease the aperture, so you let more light in for less time, or you can decrease the aperture and make the hole smaller, let in less light, which means that you need to then leave it open for longer. So we need to look at how we control the two. Most of the time I shoot on aperture priority mode on my camera, and I know that probably 90%, if not more, of professional photographers will shoot on aperture priority mode. That means you select the aperture and it will choose the shutter speed to be able to get the right exposure. Benefit of this is that I get to control the depth of field, and for me, most of the time, that's the element that I want to control. I also, because I know the difference and the ratio and how it all works, I know that I can set my aperture and then just check that the shutter speed is where I want it to be. So actually I can look at the shutter speed and think, okay, actually in this case, I'm not going to be able to hand hold it. I'm not going to be able to hold it still enough for long enough, or actually I'd like a little bit more motion blur than that, so I need to work out how to sort of slow down the shutter speed slightly. So there are two things that we can do to help us. So say you've already set your depth of field, so you've worked out exactly how deep you want the depth of field to be, you've got the focus right, it's looking fantastic, but then when you look at the image you think, I just want a little bit of motion blur in there. At that point you need to limit the amount of light that's actually coming in so that you can use a slightly longer shutter speed but keep the aperture the same. That's the point at which filters like this become really useful. This is essentially just a set of sunglasses, is the easiest way to think of it, for your camera. And it just limits the amount of light that's coming in, which means that you can then use a slower shutter speed at the same aperture. The other option, if you've actually set your aperture and you're looking at the shutter speed and you're thinking actually that's too low, is you can change the ISO. And I heard a fantastic analogy for this, which is the idea of it's borrowed light. But essentially it's just changing the sensitivity of your sensor. So in the old days when we used to use film, we'd have an ISO rating on the film that might be 100, 400, 800, and it would be set for all 36 or 24 pictures that you take, and you'd buy a film specifically thinking this was going to be an outdoor event, or this was going to be an indoor event, or this was going to be a very dark event, to try and get that sensitivity right. With your camera you can change that for every single shot. Some cameras actually use an auto ISO feature where it will change it for you for every single shot, but I do find that it'll often try and push it up before I would push it up. The lower the ISO, so ISO 100 gives you the crispest, cleanest results. As you then increase, you start to notice a little bit of noise within the picture that just looks a little bit grainy. Some people quite like it, particularly if you're converting it to black and white. It can look like old-fashioned film grain, but it can also make the picture look quite noisy if you're pushing it too high. So we can increase that ISO slightly, which means that actually it does essentially the opposite of the filter. What it does, it increases, it like lets in more light, or at least makes the sensor more sensitive to what light there is. So we can then decide, okay, we want to be able to shoot, say it's a dusk setting for example, and you want to get a landscape, so you've chosen a relatively high aperture, so you've got a nice big depth of field, but it's handheld and suddenly it's coming up at saying half a second. It's very difficult to actually hold the camera completely still for half a second. So at that point you can increase the ISO so that you can actually start to get maybe 30th, 40th of a second, which you might be able to handhold it at. So it just allows us to have that creativity within the images that we're taking. This is a ND4 filter. So this one will take out essentially 4 stops of light. So this one will decrease our exposure by 4 stops. So if we were taking a picture at 1,000th of a second, 1 stop would be 500th of a second, 2 stops would be 250th of a second, 3 stops would be 125, and 4 stops would be 160th of a second. So you can see that by putting this on, essentially we're allowing ourselves to go from 1,000th of a second to a 60th of a second at the same aperture. The ISO, if you increased it by 4 stops, you'd be able to take a picture that would normally be handheld at 60, suddenly handheld at 1,000th of a second. So it gives us that practice. But this is only a 4-stop filter. You can get a 10-stop filter as well, which I use quite a lot for landscapes and things like that. And it allows us to take a really nice slow shutter speed even in the middle of the day. And what it allows us to do is be able to get movement in the clouds, movement in the water, movement in rivers, waterfalls, and it just gives us a really soft effect that can be really quite dramatic in landscape photography. So these are all just ideas to try, but this is how to essentially start to think about the relationship between shutter speed and aperture and how it all comes together to be able to help you create the image that you want to take. So hope that was useful. This is video number 3 in a series of 20 that I'm going to be doing over the next 2 weeks. So remember to subscribe just to keep up to date with all the new videos.